we're back with more in Cape Caribbean Studies. We'll be continuing our journey today looking at institutions. I'm Melissa Beckford Simpson. Let's get right into it. So as I said, we'll be looking at institutions today. And we want to understand the development of 4 institutions. Hopefully we'll be able to complete all 4 of them. And we want to discuss their impact on Caribbean society and culture. All right? So we want to define institutions. We want to explain the 4 types of institutions. We want to discuss the extent to which the various migrations, the historical process that we already discussed. And we want to talk about the major theories, 2 major theories, the conflict and the functionalist perspective for at least 2 of these institutions. And we want to see how much these institutions have shaped Caribbean life. All right. So what is an institution, first of all? It is a social framework that shapes our lives. It is created by the society that we live in. It is enduring. It continues over time. It shapes people's lives and it determines norms and values and attitudes. And it establishes standard patterns of behavior in terms of the roles of every individual in the society. All right? So in short, institutions help to regulate the society. And what did we define as a society again? We said that a society is a locale of people with a shared common purpose, a defined territorial space, continuity over time, and citizenship within a space. So let's look at the family, the first institution, right? And we want to take it from a historical kind of explanation today, because that is important to how the Caribbean family has developed over time. So, of course, when we talk about a historical explanation, we already did this. We can't talk about anything to do with Caribbean studies and the issues of Caribbean life without talking about colonialism, slavery, resistance, indentureship, right? And of course, emancipation. So we can't talk about Caribbean life without all of these things. Let us remind ourselves of the people who we're talking about. We're talking about, first of all, the indigenous people, the Tainos and the Kalinagos, then the Europeans, first the Spanish and then the British and French and so on, then Africans, East Indians and Chinese, East Indians and Chinese after emancipation. All right? We also want to talk about enslavement and indentureship as being very, very important, because the majority of Caribbean people are Africans whose ancestors were taken across the Middle Passage here in the Caribbean and forced to work, enslaved. All right? So all of those things shape Caribbean life and Caribbean families. And so we end up with this chart right here, right? So we have the Caribbean family in the center, and we are looking at Europeans, and this is what we get from the Europeans, the nuclear family. We have in the Caribbean, which brought to us extended family system and what we also call joint households and a patriarchal kind of system. Afro-Caribbean, matrifocal in its outlook, which means that the female is the center of the household, even if there's a male present, and visiting extended and so on, right? Mixed, nuclear, extended, patriarchal. And of course, we talk about the Chinese and Syrians and so too, who came with an extended patriarchal system. So in the Caribbean, then, in a nutshell, we have a very colorful and diverse kind of family system. All right? So the Caribbean family forms. Let's look at the nuclear family now, in particular. We know the nuclear family. It is the kind of family where you have a mother and a father and a child or children, and they constitute the family. They alone live in the space that is called the home. All right? Now, this form is not necessarily the most popular, though it is widely considered to be the better form. Right? And it is Eurocentric in its ideology, because this idea of the nuclear family first came to the Caribbean via the Europeans. Right? They were the ones who said that the nuclear family, the mother and the father and the children, is the best kind of family. Do you agree? But while they said that, and they were the enslavers, they did not necessarily accommodate a kind of system where this was possible for the enslaved Africans, because the enslaved Africans did not actually get a chance to develop this kind of family unit. What then did we do? All right? We Africans are used to an extended family unit. Yes, where it's not just the mother and the father and the children, but there's also grandparents and great-grandparents and aunts and uncles who are a part of the family unit, and everybody works together to help in the upbringing of the children. All right? So you do have this idea of the extended family, or the Africans came with their understanding of the extended family, but they were not allowed to reproduce this to any great extent on the plantation. All right? But that's not to say that they did not preserve any form of family life, though they were most times prevented from doing so by the plantation owners. They did develop some form of family life. Again, with the female usually an older female, as the center, as the focal point of the family on the plantation. The male was an asset or a liability, depending on how you looked at it, right? But the woman was always the center of the family unit. Now, we also have other kinds of family types in the Caribbean, and these are actually way more common than the nuclear and the extended unit. The single parent, what we call single parent, and more so female-headed households than male-headed single parent households. We have the visiting union, which is way more popular than it is given credit for. And of course, we have common law unions. Marriages were not always encouraged by the plantation owners, and the Africans had to have the explicit permission of the plantation owner in order to jump the broom, because that was part of their tradition, right? The men and the women were not always living together. And so you did not necessarily have children growing up with this understanding of the male in the family. And of course, the family is matrifocal. All right. So, as we said, the slave marriages were sometimes banned. Polygamy was very, very common. And of course, this situation where the slave masters themselves were the fathers of the children on the plantation. Now, you find this to be very common. So in a lot of cases, it wasn't the black man who was the father. In any case, it was the white man. But we should remember that a child took the status of the mother. And so when a child is born, regardless of who fathered it on the plantation, the child would take the status of the mother and therefore would automatically become a slave as well. Unless the father, which may be the plantation owner, took some kind of liking to the child and decided that they wanted to have the child not, necessarily operating this way. And you did have some of that, because you did have white fathers who bequeathed their plantations to their offspring that were from slave women or enslaved women. All right? So we see the social hierarchy of the society. We are reminded of this. And so it is from this that you have the family unit developing. And it is characterized as generally a dysfunctional kind of system, because the fathering of the children, even though we are using these terms, fathering of the children, the fathering of the children was not something by the white man, was not something that the black woman would always welcome. And notice I said always welcome, because sometimes this was welcomed by the black woman. All right. So what are the theoretical perspectives on the Caribbean family? we always want to look at the conflict perspective, right? Put forward primarily by Marx. And we remind ourselves that Marx says of everything that the society is divided into two, the bourgeois at the top and the proletariat at the bottom. The bourgeois own the means of production. And Marx sees everything through the lens of economics, right? And capital and production. And he sees that the family unit is also used to reinforce the same kind of idea, right? About production, especially when you talk about the family unit for the proletariat who are at the bottom of the society, just used to reinforce the same inequalities in the society. All right? And so Marx talks about the working class as the proletariat and how it is that they reproduce. They reproduce as merely a part of a chain, as merely people who were going to now produce again for the bourgeois. And so that is the function of the family as Marx looks at it. All right, so what do we say of the functionalist? The functionalist says that the family is functional. It's necessary. It's important for the smooth running of the society so that society is not disordered and chaotic and anarchic, you know. It is so important to have the family structure to keep the society well ordered. And so, of course, we know that the functionalist, this is the general idea. Now we have some trends in Caribbean families, you know, we have a lot of things that go on when we talk about Caribbean families, and the idea of the Caribbean family is way more complicated than we are able to talk about right here. Because we could explore, for example, the myth of the nuclear family, right, in the Caribbean. A Eurocentric ideal and something brought forward to the Caribbean when it's not necessarily something that we subscribe to. And so family is seen as dysfunctional in the Caribbean because there are so many visiting unions and common law relationships and sibling families, right? Which is squarely where we are. Because we have this phenomena of migration in the Caribbean. A lot of parents migrate. Sometimes it's both parents, sometimes it's one parent, and they go to seek a better life for their children. And so you have this idea of the barrel children. But more than that, you have a lot of Jamaican children who are actually grown by their grandparents. Yes, very successful people too, grown by their grandparents. And you also have a lot of sibling families, an older brother or sister in charge of the younger ones. That's very, very common as well. Another issue that we have, social mobility and education in the Caribbean, and how this affects the family. You find that amongst the more educated in the society, we lean towards the nuclear, the Eurocentric ideal of the family. And so you do not have this issue of what is thought of to be dysfunctional, where the Caribbean woman is all about the place and she has several different partners, you know, and these partners are all or none at all contributing to the home that she is developing. And you have several children without any father and so on. So you have a change and, you know, a kind of trend in the Caribbean where the family forms are looking and leaning towards being more and more nuclear. But we still have those other kinds of families present, right? We talk about poverty and transactional sex, and this leading to more children, right? And then, of course, issues with the family structure, sex tourism, HIV and AIDS, all of these things affect the family form in the Caribbean. And students, in order to get a good sense, a good understanding of what we're talking about, you will need to do some reading on your own. The truth is that today we can only scratch the surface of these institutions because there are so many things to talk about. We could talk about, for example, again, the male marginalization thesis, where it is said that there are so many more women. And we can go into that as we go into education as an institution. So many more women are accessing higher education, tertiary education, right? And that there is a thrust, or there was a thrust coming some out of the 1940s and so on, for having more women educated, establishing more schools for girls and so on. But This has led to the marginalization of the male, right? The male is supposed to go work. You know, he is a man. He must go work and carrying money for the family. Oh, you mean you want to go to school, and if you spend more money upon you, if you go to school, but you go to school. You know, these are the kinds of ideas, and you still find that a number of Jamaican parents and Caribbean parents still think about it this way and still feel this way. And so we have an issue when we talk about education as an institution. All right? But there are different phases of education in the Caribbean, and we want to look at these phases, what we call pre-colonial education. You'll see these terminology, and you must reproduce some of this terminology when you are writing. What do we mean by pre-colonial? We're talking about before the era of colonialism by the Spanish and the French and the British. Now, education is not always formal, you know, in the way that we see it in a school, primary, secondary, you know, early childhood, tertiary, and so on. It's not always that way. Education also refers to the passing on of accepted values and norms. And education, in fact, begins in the home, with the family, even now. But we can look at the indigenous people and what their education system was like. In earlier lessons, we talked about the Kalinago and their induction, their rites of passage of the Kalinago male, the young male. From he's very young, he's taken from his mother. He has to go with the men, right? And then he learns to be tough. He has to pass a series of tests in order to become a man, to become male. And then the female is also cultured by the women to do the same kinds of things. I know a lot of you out there, you would have at some point or the other read The Young Warriors. And you would have seen Johnny and his friends there, you know, and this is related to the Maroons and their rites of passage that the young men had to go through. That is also education. That is also education. So the indigenous peoples had an education system. It may not be how we consider it, and it may not be considered to be formal education, but it was in fact an education system. And it was largely connected with gender roles, as we said, what females are to do, what males are to do in this society. And so it is taught. All right, so we have pre-emancipation. Was there any such thing as education before emancipation? Was there any such thing? We're talking about the period of colonialism, all right? And this is also called colonial education. But we divide it into two because colonial goes all the way up to 1962. When we became independent, well, most Caribbean countries or a number of Caribbean countries became independent beginning at 1962. All right? So we are talking about all of this period, but we have cut it into two. The pre-emancipation period, the period of working on the plantations. Was there any education whatsoever, do you think? Was there any education? Yes, there was some amount of education, but not necessarily formal education for the majority, which would be the free blacks. There was formal education for whites, right? Though it was not so very popular within the West Indies. So the young men would probably be flown back to England, to Britain, to be educated, and the young women would be sent to a finishing school and so on. So there was some formal education for the whites. Though there were no formal education systems developed for the blacks had their own education system because there was a passing on of traditions, of rights, you know, of beliefs and skills. So, for example, if you had one, you know, what they would call Mayal woman or Mayal man, right? And there's a kind of misconception about what the Mayal was about. The Mayal is different from Obia, you know. The Mayal person was usually the kind of individual who operated as a doctor, right? A bush medicine person. And this individual would know the right kind of bush for whatever it was that needed to be done. You ever hear the folk song, Helena ni muma go agrong? And Helena start fi ball for your belly. Go home, Helena, go boil seriously for your belly. Anybody know exactly what Elida was trying to do? Because the mother come home and see the bun pan the fire. And she asked the girl, what is your boil for your belly? A pie is your boil for your belly? So you did have these skills being passed on. So from early, you would have this male individual having an apprentice and the skill would be passed on, right? And that is just one example. Cooking, ways of preparing food, and all of these things were passed on from one generation to another, right? We also had the missionaries. Let's not bypass them because the missionaries, the non-conformist missionaries, we're talking about the Methodists and the Baptists and so on, they were responsible, Quakers, they were responsible for teaching a number of enslaved how to read. They did. They are non-conformists because they did not adapt to the church, to the state of the church or to the church of the state, right? So you would have Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism, and they were different. And so they would also help to teach some of the enslaved how to read. Of course, this was banned by the planters, and planters had all kinds of issues with them learning how to read. All right? So you did have this passing on, and to some extent, some of the enslaved learned how to read. All right? But post-emancipation said that there was, in fact, some attempt. And we're talking post-emancipation, we mean after 1838. We have already done the historical process, so you know what I'm talking about. The Negro Education Grant after emancipation was an attempt by the British government to allow these free blacks to learn a little bit of the elements, the 3 R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic, yes, and education. So it established primary schools, elementary schools, not necessarily secondary education or tertiary education, unheard of at this time. And so the establishment of a number of these elementary schools meant that a number of brown children could go at first, and then eventually some blacker ones could go, And so you had this kind of instruction. But the missionaries also continued to assist with the process of education. Some of them were the ones who established schools. And so you still have today, majority of the schools in Jamaica are actually church schools because most of the schools were established by these non-conformist churches, right? And then you have eventually some kind of fee paying in the secondary system, eventually. And even when this was established, so you had a few schools like the Woolmers and the Monroe and so on, and in other parts of the Caribbean too, some schools were established. But not everybody could go there, And so you had the common entrance, and the children, especially the boys who would pass the test, would be able to go on to secondary education, but it was still largely not in the hands of the majority of the people in the Caribbean. And so when the 1930s came about, and you had these riots, remember those riots we talked about in the 1930s, these were some of the issues. Apart from the wages and the working conditions, education was one of the major issues that they had a problem with. And when the Moyne Commission that we spoke about gave its report, it did say that there needed to be the establishment of schools. There needed to be education in a much wider way for the free people who lived in the Caribbean. All right, so post-independence now, we had the establishment of a number of schools, primary, secondary, and then tertiary institutions, such as the UWI, the Michael University College, very, very important, because, it became the first premier institution to actually begin to train formally. And at that time, it was mainly males that were being trained to become educators. Right? And then, of course, we had the University of the West Indies. But there were some Caribbean intellectuals, the early Caribbean intellectuals, like the Eric Williams of Trinidad, who were actually bright, so to speak. They were considered to be bright. though they were black, and the Rex Netterford and so on, and they were considered to be bright, and so they were given the opportunity to go to Britain to learn, and they came back as Caribbean intellectuals, beginning in that same 1930s period and coming further down into the independence period and so on. But the education was gendered, still gendered. We spoke about gendered education when we talked about the indigenous people, so it is not something new. But gendered in the sense that, one, there were these girls' schools, boys' schools, yes? And the education, what was taught to boys, the curriculum, what was taught to boys, the woodwork and so on and so forth. And the girls, there were certain subjects that the girls ought to do that the boys should not do, and that kind of thing. And we still have some of these things continuing today in some of these schools, the gendered education. All right, so the historical trajectory of education in the Caribbean tells us that education favors the middle class from ever since. From the Negro Education Grant began to establish primary schools, elementary schools. It rewards linguistic competence, which means that how well you are able to speak the English language. So if you chat too much patois and your talk not sound good, it sound bad, and Louis Bennett would tell us, it's a good word. There's no bad word. It's a good word. But if that is the case, then of course, that was used to judge how educated you are. Access. Who could access? Could the rural people access? Deep rural? Urban, yet ghetto? Could they access inner city communities? Who could access education? All of these things are very important in our understanding. The role of the missionaries, and of course, gender is very, very important to our understanding of education. Let us move on quickly now to religion. And as I tell you, students, we will not be able to cover the gamut of things that we need to talk about as we talk about institutions. Religion. Now, here is another one that is, very, very controversial. We talk about religion. The main religion would be Christianity in the Caribbean, and it has its roots in the coming of the Europeans, of course. Christianity was introduced as the religion. The religion of the indigenous peoples was said to be barbaric, and they had to get rid of it. They had to civilize and humanize and Christianize these people. All right? So Christianity became the standard religion, Roman Catholicism as well as Anglicanism, because eventually the Reformation would have taken place. And so you had a splintering off, and then a number of other religions, Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, and so on. But we do have other kinds of religions in the Caribbean, because the planters systematically tried to erase the African religion, but it never happened. It never happened at all. So you had distinctly African religions, such as the Voodoo and the Orisha and Obia that still continue in the Caribbean. And then you had the syncretized religions. That is where the elements of Christianity are infused into the African style of worship. And I want to show you just a very short clip of Kumina, a Kumina kind of celebration. It includes a number of African type things, the Spiritism and so on, the Shango in Trinidad, revivalism. All of these are what we call syncretic religions because they are mixed with Christianity and African elements. If you ever get the chance to see a full Kumina or a full revival ceremony, I'm telling you, you'll be thoroughly entertained. All right? And then you have the indigenous religion, Rastafari, or indigenous religion in the Caribbean. Started about the 1930s with one Leonard Howell and then continued. But it didn't. Now Rastafari has developed a kind of pride of place, but before now it wasn't so. And so Rastafari continues to walk in its own way in the Caribbean as a distinct kind of religion, a kind of protest religion. All right, so here we have scenes of Kumina and revival. Notice the symbolism there in the revival pic. And we also have scenes of Orisha here from Trinidad, Orisha ceremony, and also Rastafari right there. All right? And of course, we cannot leave out those religions that were brought by the indentured workers after emancipation, right? So we have Islam and we have Hinduism. And even though in Jamaica, these are not necessarily strong, they are strong in other Caribbean countries like Guyana and Trinidad and so on. So they are a part of the whole mix of religion in the Caribbean. And therefore, what we can say is that religion is very, very diverse and full and rich in the Caribbean. All right? What do our theorists have to say about religion? Yes? The functionalist says religion is important, right? It helps in identity. It helps to keep the status quo. It helps to keep the function in the society and the order and so on. But Marx says that religion is the opiate of the people. It's a drug, and it only serves to reinforce all of the inequalities that exist in the society, and that in the religions themselves, there's an hierarchical structure that is maintained by religion, and so religion is a part of the problem, right? So Marx says that about all of these things. So we now understand the theoretical perspective. Let us just briefly, very briefly, look at the justice system. And this one you will definitely need to do your own reading because we won't be able to cover all of what needs to be covered. We're talking about the justice system. We're talking about a legal and political system that is put in place to ensure order and chaos and to prevent chaos in the society. So we're talking about the police, we're talking about the court system, we are talking about the penal system as a part of the justice system, all right? And we're talking about laws or supreme law, the constitution that determines how we operate in the society and the establishment of the basis of our society. We're talking about the human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights that we signed on to from 1948. All of these come under what we talk about as the justice system. We can only scratch the surface today, students. So we talk about the court system. Here are some examples of some of the courts: the Petty Sessions Court, Resident Magistrates Court, High Court, and so on. And the Privy Council, which is based in Britain, in Europe, but we are moving or seeking to move into using the Caribbean Court of Justice, which was established in 2001 to serve as the final court of appeal. However, there are so many issues still with the Caribbean Court of Justice, because even though we have established it and everything, it has two jurisdictions. The domestic jurisdiction, which all the Caribbean countries who are part of CARICOM are a part of it, meaning it settles disputes between countries, right? Issues of trade and so on, settles those disputes. But the aim of the Caribbean Court of Justice is the appellate jurisdiction, which is where it now becomes our final court of appeal on criminal matters instead of going to the Privy Council. But in order for that to be done, a number of Caribbean countries need to change aspects of their constitution, and we have not yet done so. And so even though we all contribute to it, many of the Caribbean countries, most of the Caribbean countries are in fact not using the Privy Council. All right? So there's so many things that you need to talk about, that you need to discuss, that you need to read, students, because we are not able to talk about everything that the justice system has to do with. So we want you to go and read, look at the questions. And that is all we have time for today.